It was the middle of December, around 9 p.m. I was heading back home after a late shift at the office. The air was biting cold, and the train station was almost empty, save for a few tired souls like myself, desperate to get home. I caught the last train out of the city. It was an old model, one of those that rumbled and screeched every time it pulled into a station. But it was reliable, and it had always gotten me home before, so I didn't think much of it. I boarded the train, finding an empty carriage near the back. It was dimly lit, with just a few flickering lights above, and the windows were frosted over from the cold outside. As the train started moving, I leaned back, trying to relax. My head throbbed from the long day, and the rhythmic clattering of the tracks was almost soothing. There were only a couple of other passengers in my carriage, a man in a business suit a few rows ahead of me, staring blankly out the window, and an older woman knitting something slowly and methodically. The air was heavy with the smell of damp clothes and faint traces of cigarette smoke. About 10 minutes into the ride, the train suddenly jerked to a stop. We weren't near a station, I could tell from the absence of any platform outside the windows. The lights flickered off for a moment, plunging the carriage into darkness, before they sputtered back to life, weaker this time. I waited for an announcement, but nothing came. The conductor didn't make any reassuring comments over the intercom. The silence stretched on, and I could feel a knot of anxiety tightening in my chest. The other passengers looked around uneasily, but no one spoke. I checked my phone, no signal, of course. After a few more minutes of stillness, I decided to stretch my legs and maybe find out what was going on. As I passed by the businessman, I noticed his eyes were wide, and he was gripping the edge of his seat so tightly his knuckles were white. But he didn't say a word, just stared straight ahead. The older woman seemed unfazed, her knitting needles still clicking quietly together. I walked to the front of the carriage, hoping to find a conductor or someone who could explain the delay. But as I reached the door that led to the next carriage, I froze. The door was slightly ajar, and beyond it, the next carriage was pitch black. I hesitated for a moment, then pushed the door open wider. The sound it made was an eerie, low creak that seemed to echo down the length of the train. Stepping into the next carriage, the first thing I noticed was the cold. It was freezing, much colder than it should have been, even with the weather outside. The lights were out, and the only illumination came from the faint glow of emergency lights along the floor. I could barely make out the shape of the seats and the shadowy outlines of passengers slumped in them. I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the oppressive silence. No one responded. I moved closer to one of the figures, a man hunched over in his seat. When I touched his shoulder, he didn't move. I leaned in closer, and that's when I saw his face. His eyes were open, but there was no life in them. His skin was pale, almost gray, and his lips were blue. It was like he had been frozen to death. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I turned to flee back to my carriage, but something stopped me. A sound, faint at first, then growing louder, a shuffling, dragging noise coming from the far end of the carriage. My heart pounded as I turned slowly, peering into the darkness. The sound grew closer, the dragging punctuated by soft, uneven thuds. I could see something moving in the shadows, something low to the ground. It was crawling towards me, slow and deliberate. I could just make out the glint of something sharp, metallic, reflecting in the dim light. I bolted, running back through the carriage door and slamming it shut behind me. I ran past the businessman and the old woman, neither of whom reacted as I rushed by. I didn't stop until I was back in my seat, panting and sweating despite the cold. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I had just seen, but nothing added up. It felt like a nightmare, but it was real too real. The train suddenly lurched forward again, almost throwing me from my seat. The lights flickered, then stabilized, glowing a little brighter now. We were moving, but something was wrong. I glanced at the other passengers. The businessman was no longer in his seat. The old woman was still there, but her knitting had stopped. She was staring at me now, her eyes unblinking. When the train pulled into my station, I didn't wait for it to come to a complete stop. I grabbed my bag and ran out, not daring to look back. As I reached the platform, I noticed something strange. The station was deserted, not a single soul in sight. The usual sounds of city life were muted, almost non-existent. The train doors closed behind me with a heavy thud, and as it pulled away, I could have sworn I saw the shadowy figure from the dark carriage staring at me through one of the windows. I never took the train again after that. I still don't know what happened that night, or what I saw. Sometimes I try to convince myself it was just my imagination, that I was too tired and my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know it was real. Something was on that train with us, something that shouldn't have been there. And every now and then, when I'm walking alone at night, I hear that same dragging sound behind me, faint and distant. I never look back.